Willpower, or Your Dynamic Forces. By W. Atkinson and Edward E. Beals. Chapter 1. Willpower. Of all the varied manifestations of power, proceeding from that power, which the best human thought perceives to be the source and origin of all the power in the universe, that manifestation which we know as willpower seems to be the most fundamental, the most elemental, and the most universal. It is seen by philosophers to constitute the very kernel or heart of all phases and forms of personal power. Many, indeed, have held that in willpower abides the ultimate principle of the universe, and that all forms of power, force, and energy, at the last, must be thought of in terms of willpower. Whatever may be the ultimate facts of the universe, there can be no dispute concerning the dominating position occupied by willpower in the life and being of the individual man. When you undertake the task of self-analysis, you will find your will at the very center of your being, so close to the I am I, or ego, that it is most difficult to disentangle it from your real self. Your sensations, your passions, your emotions, your tastes, and your talents are found to be under the control of your trained will. You may set them aside from yourself and analyze them, correct them, improve them, but the will lies closer to yourself. You cannot set it apart from yourself as you can the other mental states. It is neither sensation nor emotion, though it may dominate both. It is always subjective and active, abiding and operating from the very citadel of your being. Emotion and thought may lie deep in your being, but will lies still deeper. Emotion and thought are objective to the will, and may be influenced and directed by it. You are conscious of your sensations and of your emotions as merely incidental to your existence. But you are directly conscious of your will, just as you are conscious of your self-existence. You can modify your other mental states, but you cannot modify your will. In the same way, the will is your sole instrument of modification, and it cannot be turned back on itself. The office of the will is that of action, and in its activities, it directs and orders, commands, and regulates the other mental states. In fact, the will acts chiefly through and by me, and of its control and direction of your other mental states. Willpower may be developed and trained, of course, otherwise, this book would have no purpose and intent. But it is not to be developed and trained as are the other mental states or powers, for these are modified by the action of the will upon them. Unlike theirs, its development consists rather of the unfolding into a fuller expression of a fundamental power that already exists, the transformation of latent and static will into active and dynamic will. This form of development is defined as the act of freeing from that which envelopes. Its training, likewise, is different. Instead of its being trained by a higher mental faculty or power, the will itself proceeds to improve, deepen, widen, and strengthen the channels through which its currents flow. We, therefore, employ the term, the development and training of the will, only in this sense. Will culture really is the process of providing the will with the appropriate mental instruments for its fuller expression and manifestation, and of encouraging it to employ them. The will always is there, abiding in full power. It is your part to supply it with the proper incentives to action, and to furnish it with the channels of habit and use through which it may flow freely. Strange to say, you must employ the powers of will itself in order to provide these requisites for its own fuller expression. At the last, the will itself must will to provide itself with the instruments of willing. The will must will to will, and to will into being the instruments of its future willing. But the will always is content to do these things when properly aroused. We need not labor to convince you that it is desirable for you to possess developed and trained will power. You know from your own experience and observation that to have a strong will is to be a strong individual, one who is regarded with respect. You know also that to have a weak will is to be a weak individual, one to be pitied, if not indeed to be scorned. You may, however, have fallen into the error of supposing that the possessors of the strong will are individuals especially favored and blessed by nature, or by the powers above nature. You may be among those who regard strength of will as akin to height, complexion, or similar personal characteristics which have been bestowed upon certain individuals without any effort on their part, and to which no other individuals may hope to attain if they have not been born with them. If you have fallen into this error, now is the time for you to rid yourself of it. Thoughtful psychologists take an entirely different view of the case. While recognizing the fact that to some individuals the manifestation of willpower is easier at the beginning, that it comes more naturally to some than to others, those who have made a careful study of this subject know that it is equally true that each and every individual has within himself a bountiful supply of latent willpower which he may develop and train to a marvelous degree if he will employ the proper scientific methods. In fact, experience has proved that many of the individuals who have thus acquired a high degree of willpower are able to manifest it more consistently and more habitually than many of those who were born to it but who have not learned how to apply it effectively. It is true that in order to develop and train your willpower you will need to arouse and apply a certain degree of will itself. You will also find that your willpower once set into operation in this direction will rise to the occasion and that your supply of such power will prove to be equal to your demands upon it. One may start with even a far less degree of willpower than that possessed by the average man, and then proceed step by step in an ever-increasing ratio of attainment and development until the heights are reached. Accompanying the very application of willpower to the task of developing itself by special training, there is a correlated arousing of its latent energies. The employment of willpower in this effort tends to strengthen and energize its power of manifestation in other directions. We ask you to take careful notice of this peculiar situation. Willpower may be developed and trained only by willpower. Willpower is required to develop and train willpower. Willpower is self-developed and self-trained. Willpower applies its energies to itself, and by means of this, it tends to perfect and improve itself. The other mental faculties and powers find it necessary to call on willpower to perfect them, but willpower requires no outside aid, and can obtain none. It must ever fall back upon its own inherent powers when it wishes to develop or improve itself. If you had no willpower, you would never be able to develop any, since you would have nothing else with which to develop it. But, fortunately, you have will to start with, though it may exist merely in a latent or dormant state. Willpower is your heritage, and it will be at your service if you demand it. When you employ willpower to develop willpower, you not only build a mental path over which the will thereafter travels, but you also actually strengthen and develop the will itself by the very task of building such paths or roads. In creating the tools for the use of the will, you also render the will itself stronger, better, and more efficient. Here we have a striking illustration of the old biblical statement that to him who hath shall be given. The more persistent and long-continued the efforts of your will, to develop and train your willpower, the stronger will your will become by reason of the energies expended in the effort. By employing willpower in the task, you will actually gain willpower as the result. This is a very significant fact, and one which you should always bear in mind. The more of will you give, the more of will you have. This is the way of the will. Here at the very beginning, you should realize that there is no royal road to the development and training of willpower.